I think we started kind of thinking about this because you picked up a launch PS3. Why did you buy one, Murph?
Original fat PlayStation 3s. It's something that I wish was a cool all-inclusive solution, and it kind of is, but it's not a practical all-in-one solution. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Shine Get podcast. I'm your host, Murph, as always, with my good friend, Cal.
Hello, Murph. I'm here. It's a beautiful, freakishly warm Saturday here in Columbus, Ohio. So you know what that means. It's time to get into my office and talk with my good buddy Murph about some video games.
Yeah, it's kind of freakish here because it's Southern California and it's raining. So I don't know. I feel like our weather
crazy
like
weather
or something.
all over the place.
Anyway, today we are going to be talking about backwards compatibility with specifically consoles. So what is it? How does it function? How does it work? The different types of backwards compatibility, all that and more in this episode. Cal, why do we care about backwards compatibility at all in the first place?
So it turns out as video game history continues on and on and on, as hardware technology continues to evolve, as software technology continues to evolve, as game maker ambitions gets larger and larger and larger, console manufacturers, and then also, to some extent, PC gaming as well, but that's not relevant to this conversation. Console manufacturers will simply be releasing new, more powerful consoles with new and flashy features. But what does that do to the poor, venerable games left behind on the previous generation console, or consoles, plural?
They're just gone forever. Nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, gone forever. Nothing you can do about it. Obviously, the thing you could do if you would like to continue playing those games, which as a podcast largely focused on, in many ways, video game collecting, is something we've talked about a lot on the show. But a big option, just keep your console, play those things, but that's, takes up space. Maybe you want to sell your old console to help fund the new console. Not everyone has infinite money like Murph. And maybe
I wish.
you want to. No, I know, I'm kidding. All that for one reason or another. Maybe you're not going to have that old console anymore, and you would still like to be able to play your games. Well, that is quite literally only possible if there is some kind of backwards compatibility baked into your system in one way or the other. I think there are kind of two types of backwards compatibility, two really big tents, one larger than the other. There is complete hardware backwards compatibility, which I think is the truest form of backwards compatibility and is usually what people are referring to when they talk about it. Very much the all right, I have a video game console. I can insert a disc, a cartridge, what have you, from a previous generation console of last generation or even further than that, and the game will just work. I don't have to download stuff. I don't have to worry about it. Maybe on some newer stuff, you might have to download a little patch or whatever, but insert disc, play game. And that kind of hardware level compatibility used to be way more common than it is now. We'll talk about that, obviously. And then the second, and definitely the larger tent, which could maybe be split into a couple more types if you really wanted to get really finicky about it, is kind of like the software plus onboard emulation backwards compatibility, which is the onboard emulation almost fits into the former category. And in some cases definitely does, but in some cases does not. And then the software opens up a whole bundle of okay, you can buy old games on this new console, and it's basically like you're buying a license to emulate, blah, 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 blah. It gets messy and complicated really quick, but 95% of what we're going to talk about today, I think, does fit into the category of insert thing into console, play game. Right.
Yeah. But even so, there's a little bit more of a subsection of that as well, because insert gameplay thing is good, but sometimes insert gameplay thing still will involve some method of emulation. Right. So I think the best possible backwards compatibility you can usually get is insert disc, play game, but that console also will have the onboard pieces of the previous generation console or whatever console it is trying to have backwards compatibility of already on board.
Which just reduces the complexity, reduces chances of having problems, or reduces straight out, games not working, which can happen in some circumstances, just like altogether.
Exactly. It is a lot more likely that a game is going to work if it just has the pieces from the system that it was made to work on, right? So we're going to go through consoles one by one of pretty much all the main stuff, and we're just going to talk about backwards compatibility of it. How useful is it? Like, should you even use this method of backwards compatibility? And what we think like the gold standard of backwards compatibility is amongst all these consoles. So to start off, first off, I wanted to get the one Sega backwards compatibility thing out of the way, because Sega doesn't really have much in the terms of backwards compatibility like at all. Like Dreamcast can't play Saturn games. Saturn can't play Genesis games. Although I wish it could, because it has a cartridge port on board as well as the Genesis CPU, which I did not know for the longest time. So what the heck? Why are you not able to make the Genesis games work on the Saturn? Come on, Sega. Anyway, the Sega Genesis, actually has all its components that it needs in order to play Master System games already on board. Like, it has the CPU, it has the sound chip, it has everything that it needs in order to play Master System games. The only thing that it doesn't have is the cartridge slot doesn't fit. And some Master System games also came on like little cards instead of cartridges, so obviously it can't play those either. But all you need is something called the power base converter, which is literally just a little plastic piece that you put on top that then is an adapter that lets you put those cards in, or cartridges. It can be either. And turns out the controller port for the Genesis is the exact same controller port as the Master System. So you can play it with Genesis controllers. You can play it with the original Master System controllers. However you want to do it, it just makes it that you don't really need a Master System in order to play pretty much any Master System game out there. You just need a Genesis with a power base converter. The downside of that is, I believe you need this on the Model 1. The Model 2s, they don't fit. So yeah, that's basically it for Sega stuff. Like, the power base converter, use it if you want to play Master System games, because Genesises are awesome. That's kind of it.
How do we feel about like external hardware allowing for
backwards compatibility, or like even side grade compatibility? Because that like opens up a little bit of can of worms when we move to the Nintendo section, actually. Yeah, but it's kind of funky, right? Because like, everything is there, except you just need an adapter for the cartridge slot.
Fit the pins. Yeah,
that's all it is.
Yeah, fit the pins in there. Yeah.
I don't know. This one feels like not that egregious as far as extra things that you need.
Definitely not egregious by any way, shape, or form. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say it still counts as backwards compatibility, just with one extra step. So it's not perfect. It's not like out of the box, you can automatically do it. You just need this one piece, and then you can make it work.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you, Sega, for handling that for us.
Thank you, Sega,
very much.
And then for never doing it again.
Well, it's because they simply were entirely subsumed by gaming conglomerate giant Nintendo. I think Nintendo has done a really interesting job over time of like, I don't know, they've ever since we've entered the disc era, it seems they have done a decent job of having backwards compatibility on their systems. But where we definitely saw the most backwards compatibility across their catalog was in their handhelds. Every new Game Boy could play all previous Game Boy games. You have the original Game Boy. Here comes the Game Boy Pocket. It's smaller. It can still play Game Boy games. Sure, whatever. You get the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color can play Game Boy games and Game Boy Color games. And then there was even some weird, there were games that worked on both the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. Very fun. And then a lot of games that only worked on the Game Boy Color. Well, then here comes along the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance can play Game Boy Advance games, Game Boy Color games, and original Game Boy games, all on your Game Boy Advance. And then even the Game Boy Advance SP could still play all of those older games as well. The Game Boy Micro came along and it could only play Game Boy Advance games, but it was such a commercial flop. We don't talk about it, right?
We want to talk about the Micro.
And then the Nintendo DS came out. And then, the Nintendo DS was actually originally in a really weird spot where Nintendo was like, all right, we have the GameCube and we have the Game Boy Advance. And so we're going to try something experimental over here. But since it basically was a Game Boy Advance that also had de facto a lot more stuff going on because it had full Game Boy Advance backwards compatibility, you weren't missing out on much unless you really wanted to play your Game Boy Color and original Game Boy games. You know, the DS, it could play all your DS stuff, and then 100% backwards compatibility with the Game Boy Advance. They lost it there for a little bit with the DSi revisions for the Nintendo DS, but those were weird. Never really seemed like they had a great like idea for in mind with what they were doing with the DSi. And
they were like trying to compete with smartphones.
Yeah,
and stuff with
exactly.
The DSi.
It's like, okay, you can get on the internet, that kind of stuff. It has a okay camera on it, shockingly okay camera for the time on it. On that, get that DSi XL camera, start pointing that places. And then the 3DS came out, and then the 3DS line was 100% backwards compatible with the normal DS stuff. And definitely very interesting, specifically about the DS. I'm not sure how hardware backwards compatibility worked for the Game Boys and stuff, but like the DS just had Game Boy stuff in it. That was how they were, you know, not messing around with emulation, not worried about anything like that. They just put Game Boy stuff into the DS in addition to the DS stuff, and that just made it work.
Yes, actually, that's exactly what they did with the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance has an original Game Boy CPU inside it and doesn't actually use it for like anything other than actual playing of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Fun fact, the way the system detects what CPU to use is actually this little switch in the cartridge bay that will get depressed if you put a Game Boy or Game Boy Color game in. But it's not going to get pressed if you put a Game Boy Advance game in because of the shape differences of the cartridge. But yeah, as a result, like the compatibility across pretty much Nintendo's entire handheld line is like really, really good. And there's very, very few titles that will not play. Basically everything you could ever want or need will be able to play on a newer console with the backwards compatibility of the older console. So realistically, at least as far as I'm concerned, I kind of just have a modded Game Boy Advance that can play Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games. And the mod has like an IPS screen on it, so it's a lot brighter. It's very the original fat one. Much one thing I don't like about the SP is like, yes, it can play original Game Boy games.
We have big man hands.
But it sticks down at the bottom.
Yes, it does. And
it kind of jams into your hands. And so it's like, well, that's less comfortable. Sure, so even though it's
just have it
works,
flying out of the top. On the original one. Yeah.
And there's some things like the Game Boy camera, like, is not going to work in the Game Boy Advance SP.
No, you just have to like
flip it over. Yeah. Because it's expecting that the cartridge slot is going to come out the top.
Yeah, out of the top. Yep.
Right. So there's a couple things that depend on, well, the cartridge slot is going to be here. As a result, I'm not going to be able to function. I'm not going to be able to work in later revisions that don't really take that into account. So those are very minor things, but still things to consider, which is why I think the Game Boy Advance, the original Game Boy Advance, is the best version to play all these games. Again, assuming you get a screen that you can actually see.
Yeah.
If not, an SP is pretty good. And then,
you can get yourself a 3DS or a 3DX XL, and then that covers your bases for the 3DS and the DS games.
Yeah, exactly. The 3DS has a different screen resolution of the DS, and so it stretches things a little bit. But I have a DSi XL, and honestly, the difference between playing on a DSi XL, which has the pixel perfect resolution, and a 3DS XL, which stretches it a little bit, it's not that different. People go on and on about how much better it is. It's definitely a little better, but is it worth buying a whole nother handheld? For most people, I would say no. So being able to play all of Nintendo's back catalog of handheld stuff with only 2 consoles, I think is pretty incredible and kind of awesome.
And if you really, really, really want to play your original, like if you want to play DS games at the original resolution, when you're launching a DS game, hold down start or select, and it'll launch in its original resolution on your screen. Especially if you're playing on a 3DS XL, it will look really funny because it's like piled up at the top, really small. It will be the size of a DS screen on your 3DS or whatever. But if you really worried about that, you could still do it on a 3DS if you want it.
You sure can. One thing about the 3DS that is also a little bit interesting is it can play old Game Boy games and Game Boy Color games, but it does those through the eShop.
Yep.
through.
Was that technically Virtual Console? Is that what they called it at the time? Or no?
I believe
it was buy the games. Yeah.
I believe it was still under the Virtual Console branding at that time. Yep. Yes.
Yep.
But you could play those games. They didn't have Game Boy Advance games at that time. They had a few special Game Boy Advance games that you could get if you were an early adopter and bought
the 3DS
a 3DS
Ambassador program.
Yes. Yeah. So what is the 3DS Ambassador program, Cal?
Oh man, the 3DS when it launched was so expensive. And also I think like they just didn't really have a great launch titles for it and all that kind of stuff. A lot of people did not really buy into the 3DS, and about a year or so in, they did a bit of a redesign. They basically almost like relaunched it entirely with a new price point and all that kind of stuff. And then anyone who was in that kind of first window of owning a 3DS in that time you could apply and be put into something called like the 3DS Ambassador program, which if I recall correctly, they pretty much just gave you a bunch of free retro games.
Yeah, they gave you a bunch of free Game Boy Advance games because Nintendo was like, we don't want our customers to feel bad that they were early adopters. We don't want them to feel bad that they took a chance on us and then we cut the price and made it less expensive for everybody else. We want them to feel like, yeah, you put that extra money in, but you still got something out of it. The downside of that is, well, yeah, the 3DS can play Game Boy Advance games, but never came out.
It was much shorter than a year. It was like a couple months before they dropped the price. They launched the 3DS in America in March, and then they dropped the price from $250 to $170 in August.
Insane.
Yeah.
So yeah, it makes sense why they did it, but crazy.
Yep. You got 10 NES games and 10 Game Boy Advance games. That's kind of fun. It's kind of cool.
Yep.
But yeah, this kind of backwards compatibility is the second type of compatibility I was talking about earlier, and this will become more and more of a thing that we kind of talk about and around when it comes to more and more new consoles, because there are a lot of old games that are available in their original form on these digital eShops where you can buy them and they will work on your console. And this is just like one example of that where, yeah, if you wanted to play Oracle of Seasons or whatever on your 3DS without going and paying $70 and getting a Game Boy Color to play it, you could do that on your 3DS. That's kind of nice. I think you paid $12 for it. Or something akin to that on the 3DS. That's a good deal. That's nice. But it's still a little bit different than, cool, I own Oracle of Seasons already, and I would like to put it into my DS. Oh, I cannot. But you could put it into your Game Boy Color, your Game Boy Advance, or your Nintendo DS. Not your Nintendo DS, my bad. Your Game Boy Color or your Game Boy Advance, which is kind of neat. Okay, that's a long time about Nintendo handhelds. There's still every Nintendo console past the N64.
True. One last thing, though. 3DS eShop, obviously completely down. So if you want any of these Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, you do have to have a modded system in order to get these games back onto your system. So keep that in mind if that's something that you're looking out for. Anyway, now we can move on to other Nintendo systems. Yes. Cal, I think you should take the lead on this one.
Yep.
What is the next console that Nintendo made that has any form of backwards compatibility?
Okay, so the backwards compatibility history for Nintendo consoles proper does start actually relatively late in the overall history of Nintendo consoles. The first backwards compatible console for Nintendo is the Wii, all the way into the 2000s, and the launch Wii was hardware, aka just straight up GameCube stuff inside of the Wii, backwards compatible with the GameCube. You had the console ports on top, you had the memory cards, you had a whole GameCube processing unit stuff in the Wii, which actually wasn't that hard because the Wii in many ways architecturally was basically like a slightly souped up GameCube. It's not like hardware, software, infrastructure, not actually that different at all. Which
the processor of the
advantage.
Wii, the Broadway, is basically just a souped up Gecko, which is the processor that is at the heart of the GameCube.
Which makes it like one-to-one really easy to just completely play games right out of the box. Put your GameCube games into the Wii. It just works fine and dandy, cool, yay. Again, later hardware revisions, the family version of the Wii and also the Wii Mini, later revisions where they were really cost cutting to, get the absolute most money out of people who are still buying Wiis in the year of our Lord, like 2011 or something. They, to save money, they just, took out all that hardware and, sure, whatever, cool. But then, the Wii U came out. On the Wii U, you could play Wii games. Simple, easy peasy. And then we made the Switch, obviously not backwards compatible with the Wii U, kind of with like a media change there, right? That's kind of
from disc to cartridges, yeah.
Yeah, disc to cartridge. Well, and that's a really big reason why I think we didn't see any backwards compatibility before that with Nintendo's other consoles, because they were just like a bunch of really different form factor
very different
cartridges.
Internally as well.
Yeah, very different internally and very different form factor of cartridges. Like when you were talking about the power base converter, I was like, I feel like I'm going crazy. I'm going to double check and make sure there wasn't something like that where you could like plug NES games into the SNES or, Super Famicom games into the Famicom, something akin to that. But no, the internally they were just so different that just like there wasn't enough juice to make that happen. And they were not interested in putting the internals of an NES into a Super NES to make that happen.
It's not very efficient because you're putting all these things in that don't theoretically matter to the new console, and it's just like, well, that's just wasted hardware cost in order to do this thing that people could just leave their NES hooked up, right?
But then at a point, I think it kind of became like an expectation that you would be able to. And I think like actually the weirdest implementation award is the Wii U being backwards compatible with the Wii across all of these things, where to play your Wii games, you had to like basically launch we're going to like launch the Wii OS. We're going to insert Wii mode on the Wii U so we can play Wii games on the Wii U. Weird.
Do you know why it does that?
No, I don't.
So the Espresso, which is the CPU at the heart of the Wii U, is pretty much a Broadway, which is the Wii's
which is
CPUs,
pretty much a Gecko.
which is pretty much a Gecko, but it has 3 cores. So it has some more advanced features, but it has 3 cores instead of 1. So literally what this thing does is when you launch the Wii mode thing, the whole console shuts down, turns on a single core, and boots thinking that it's a Wii.
Yeah, that's funny.
It just boots the Wii home software on an Espresso single core.
Which then is essentially, for all intents and purposes, a Broadway.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Which is why it's so like kind of hacky of how it works. But yeah, I mean, that one also works, and it works quite well.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that it doesn't support GameCube games, which you'd think that it would, considering like it all shares the exact same DNA. I'm not entirely sure why they didn't do that. Maybe they didn't want to worry about the controller ports, the memory cards, but they had the USB to GameCube adapter anyway.
Eventually, yeah. Well, it came pretty late in the life cycle of the Wii U.
This was like 2 years later. It was for Smash Brothers. So it felt a little odd that this was just something that they never
it just
tackled.
was like completely incapable of doing it. Yeah.
So but yeah, the Switch and Switch 2 are also a little bit odd because the Switch 2 plays Switch 1 games, but the way that it works is it does like a partial emulation where it has some hardware that's the same, but it also has like an emulation layer that will help it actually run Switch 1 games, which means that it's not perfect, but it is actually pretty good. When the Switch 2 came out, I think this was something that we talked about where we were like, we want Switch 1 games to run and to be able to run well on this. And I think that's kind of crucial to its success because the Switch library is just so enormous and people are going to have such huge back catalogs that being able to play your Switch games and play them well is going to be a huge factor towards if people are actually going to use this thing. And it does work pretty darn well. It works very well. And I'm very happy to say that after testing, like I have not run into a single issue. It's not saying that there aren't any issues
either. I personally haven't run into any. I think I can't play World of Goo. I think I literally cannot play World of Goo because World of Goo relies entirely upon the IR sensor from the original Joy-Cons, which, I mean, maybe I could play it if I hooked up an original set of Joy-Cons, but there's probably not an IR rear or whatever. But from what I recall, World of Goo is not compatible with the Switch 2. And I think that's the only thing I've run into.
Yeah. So Switch 2, very good, works well, but the way that it does it is kind of funky. It's a weird like hybrid approach, which I guess is apt for the Switch being like hybrid jack of all trades kind of system.
and even like the Switch 2 now, Nintendo has always been like weirdly half active in the you can buy our old games virtually and play them as digital download on your console. Now, you know, there's a decent selection if you are a Nintendo Online Plus, especially Plus subscriber, where you get access to a lot of NES games and then a decent amount of SNES and N64 games and Sega Genesis games. And I think another Sega console. I could be wrong. I think it might be just Genesis games. And then now like 4 or 5 GameCube games. The amount of GameCube games is ever growing. That just feels kind of like, I don't know. It doesn't feel that backwards compatible to me, especially being like associated with a subscription or whatever. But even a lot of the virtual console stuff has never really felt to me that much like quote unquote backwards compatibility. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know how you feel about that, Murph.
I don't know. It is kind of weird, like you said, because it is yield. Like you can't take the games that you already own and use those games that you already own in order to play new games or play on a new system, which is kind of what backwards compatibility I think is in essence. But at the same time, like it is still a good feature to have. It's a nice feature to have. The quality of, I think, the emulation does vary from console to console. The Wii's emulation of like N64 was actually like weirdly good, especially for that era. I know NES emulation on like the Wii U was really bad. Super Nintendo emulation was pretty good. And then overall, I think across the board, the emulation for Switch and Switch 2 is pretty good, but it has a little too much latency for my liking. There definitely are still errors and stuff in trying to translate those games, but you are never, ever going to get perfect compatibility with emulation. It's just not going to happen. Like, you do your best, you're going to try, there will be errors. As long as you can play the game and play it without any major errors, I think that's really all most people are looking for. And Virtual Console is able to do that.
I do gotta say, I did always really appreciate there is a very small subsection of DS games you could get on the Wii U.
Yeah.
And that makes perfect sense because it has the hardware capability of doing it, which is so funny.
Because it has the touchscreen.
It has both screens, and one of them is a touchscreen. So you can have the top screen on the TV and the bottom screen on your tablet. And so you could play the DS games.
Yep. And obviously that uses full emulation, but then there's other things like the Game Boy player that plays Game Boy Advance games. That is just a Game Boy Advance. Like, it has the Game Boy Advance hardware stuck in there.
And like same with the Super Game Boy or whatever a similar thing was.
It has
for
Game Boy
the Super
pieces in
Nintendo.
it.
Yeah, it's just a Game Boy that you can plug into your Super Nintendo. Cool.
Yeah. Fun fact, that uses the clock speed of the Super Nintendo instead of the correct clock speed for a Game Boy. So games actually run a little bit too fast. They're a little too fast. Audio is a little bit too high pitched. Once you notice it, you can never unhear or unsee it.
Notice it.
Sorry to ruin that for you.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah. So you had said previously that Nintendo wasn't very good at backwards compatibility, but then once it got to like 2000s, then they started like actually taking that into account. I think the reason that they started to do that was because of one company that started making it a huge focus and like a huge selling point of their consoles, and that was the Sony PlayStation, specifically the PlayStation 2. And it's honestly unheard of up to that point, like compatibility with the PlayStation 1. Because like up to this point, where like, yeah, the Master System and Genesis is like the best that you can possibly get, and you still need an extra piece to do it. But guess what the PS2 does? Plays PS1 games pretty much perfectly. Again, not fully error-free. There are a couple of games that tend to have issues and a couple of games that don't run. But by and large, across the board, you have thousands and thousands of games for the PlayStation 1, and they just work. And not only does the PlayStation 2 play PlayStation 1 games relatively perfectly, It also can just let you plug in a PlayStation 1 controller, and it just works. A PlayStation 1 memory card. The slots are the same. Everything just works. And so it made it was very easy to go from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2 for that very reason. Heck, the AV cables are the same.
Yeah, they're literally the same.
Like, the port is the same.
And it's still bad.
Yeah, it's still bad. It's not a great port. But as far as simplicity goes, like, there's not much better that you can get than the PlayStation 2. One thing that a lot of people don't know about the PlayStation 2 is, well, it does have hardware compatibility. It has the R3000, which is the CPU of the PS1, on board. But for the Slim, in order to get it that dang small, they took it out. And so Slims use partial emulation in order to achieve PlayStation 2 or PlayStation 1 backwards compatibility. And so they tend to have a few more issues on top of that. So if you want perfect compatibility, well, again, I keep saying perfect, but it isn't actually perfect.
As close to as perfect as it can be.
As close to perfect as you can possibly get. You get a fat PlayStation 2. Yep. But eventually, if you get a Slim, they will have ripped out that CPU, but you still can play, by and large, most PS1 games without issue on your PlayStation 2. And again, still, you can plug in the memory cards, plug in the controllers, and it all
it's just like
works.
Literally everything you had from your PS2 you could take forward, which from your PS1 rather.
I keep saying PS2 as well,
which is like a completely different level. Like, we also saw that, I guess, from like GameCube to Wii. All of your GameCube stuff worked 100% with your original launch Wii. Kind of the same thing, PS1 to PS2, but those two things are very big outliers. I guess all the Wii stuff worked with the Wii U, but it was all wireless at that point. Nothing super hardware-y that's easier to do. But that's honestly really impressive. I think that's like to be lauded that, you know, they very easily could have been like, okay, we're going to have you save PS1 games on a PS2 memory card, and it's going to be really weird, and you can only use your PS2 controllers with your PS1 games, and that'll be a little bit funky, but you know, just get a PS2. You could have no games for it and still play all of your PS1 stuff, no problem. Sick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The only funky thing is the PS1 games must use a PS1 memory card. You can use a PS2 controller or a PS1 controller, it doesn't really matter. But as far as the memory cards, PS1 games have to be saved to a PS1 memory card. PS2 games have to be saved to a PS2 memory card. So that is the only potential downside of this thing that I can possibly think of. Heck, it even has like an option to do like a fast loading from the disc. They're like, hey, if you want to try this, you can try to load games a little bit faster. The laser will read a little bit faster. If it causes incompatibility, turn it off.
Yep, just turn it off. Turn it off.
So it'll save you like a couple seconds in loading. It's not the craziest thing in the world, but the fact that they have that at all is nice. And like PS1 games, they'll run at their original resolution too. Like, they're not upscaled or anything. They're a nice, crisp 240p. Does potentially have an issue.
Just what we want.
Yeah, but you don't want it 480i. You don't want a PS1 game that's 240p to be like, oh, actually, I'm 480i, and now you're going to have to de-interlace me. And it's like, no, that looks bad and weird.
Yep.
But sometimes HD TVs don't really know what to do with the 240p image. So some people will be like, well, PS1 games don't work on PS2 over components. That's not true. Your TV just doesn't know what to do with them. It does all work and works great. So, that out of the way. Now let's talk about the slightly more complicated.
Slightly?
The way more dang complicated. PlayStation 3.
So I think some interesting background here is that I think we started kind of thinking about this, kind of talking about this because you recently bought a launch PS3, a fat PS3, whatever you want to call it, in which, you know, the main distinguishing factors from other PS3s, in addition to having like 55 ports on them that I don't understand what any of them were supposed to be for. I also have had a launch PS3 on it? And,
sure.
Yeah, exactly. I have also had a launch PS3 in the past. You picked up a launch PS3 because we have kind of been, you and I have been kind of banding around the idea of like, oh, what would it be like to like, you know, downsize? How much could you downsize your collection and then like still be happy with all of the games you had access to? Or like, what is the way you get maximum access to as many hardware games as possible with as few consoles as possible. It's a fun thought experiment and kind of low key. An important part of that would be a launch PS3. You picked up a launch PS3. Why did you buy one, Murph?
Because I really liked the idea, like you said, of everything all in one console. PS2 games, they don't look amazing, so I was like, well, maybe the PlayStation 3 can help with that. It has a smoothing filter on it, has a smoothing feature on it, which from what I've heard does help. So I was like, okay, well, they're a little pricey, but they're not the craziest thing in the world. They're like $200-$300 or something like that. So I saved up and I did buy one. But when I got one, the PS2 laser, the DVD laser, was finicky and worked a little less than half the time. So yeah, I was able to put some games in, test some stuff out. It would play Blue Disc PS2 games just fine, which use the CD laser, because those are just CDs just fine. So I was like able to play Crazy Taxi 1 just fine, got lots of reps in on that. But the rest of my PS2 library, I was like, well, I'll put this in and hope it works. And yeah, I ended up having to return it because of that very reason. But yeah, the PlayStation 3, the original launch models, the smoothing feature does help a little bit. But PS2 games they're weird. So most PS2 games don't run at a full standard resolution. So standard res is 640 by 480. Most PS2 games are 512 by 448. So they're actually, yeah, it's to lighten the rendering load on the PlayStation 2. Because what ends up happening with old tube TVs is that you would cut off the top and bottom and sides of the screen anyway. Yeah. So what's the point in rendering stuff to that area? So the downside would be that you don't get those extra margins, and you might have like little slivers of black on the sides or bottom, depending on your tube TV. But the upside is that you get a lot, maybe not a lot, but you get better performance because you don't have to render as many pixels. But when you start doing that in PlayStation 3, the PlayStation 3 is like, well, you are giving me a 512 by 448 resolution. Okay. And then it just puts it up there, and then there's black bars at the top and bottom, and then the entire image is squished just a little bit, so everything seems a little bit too skinny, because a CRT TV will take that image and just stretch it to a 4:3 resolution, or not resolution, excuse me, aspect ratio. And it's like, yeah, sure, I'll just take that. I'll stretch it to whatever I need to be. Just doesn't really matter. So people didn't like define the horizontal resolution as strictly, because they're like, whatever, the TV will take care of it. But when you start getting to digital video, then you have to define that, and you have to have that stretch. So one thing I like about the RetroTink and the RetroTink 4K is that it is able to do that stretch, and I can choose what I want it to be. So if the game is like, yeah, I exactly want a perfect square pixel 1-to-1, this is how the game was intended to look, your circles look like circles, you can do that. But if you're like, oh, the whole image looks a little bit too skinny, clearly they didn't properly define the horizontal resolution of this, and they're like, whatever, the screen will take care of it, then you can physically like stretch it out a little bit to the desired length. You can't really do that with the PlayStation 3.
Yeah, when you're putting it through an HDMI and plugging it into an HDMI, an HD TV. HD TVs already struggle enough if you like try to put standard resolution into them.
Yeah, it does.
What about a completely non-standard thing, right?
Yeah, the PS3 is nice in that it does do the upscaling in and of itself. So you don't have to worry about your TV doing a bad upscaling job of deinterlacing that 480i image and then upscaling it to 1080p or 4K or whatever it is. It will be like, hey, I'll deinterlace your 480i image for you and then upscale it to 1080p. And then pretty much every TV under the sun knows what to do with a 1080p image and will make that look good, right? So that part is good. But yeah, I don't like how it's just everything is a little too skinny, and I don't have fine controls on my TV to stretch it. So I basically have to send that bad boy back through the RetroTink, which at that point, what the heck am I even doing here? What are we doing here?
And so I guess I accidentally buried the lead here when we very first started. The original launch PS3 does literally just have PS2 hardware in it. So that makes all of that way easier. And then, as we move past the original launch PS3, which had its problems, they pretty quickly did a revision that then could still play PS2 games. But once again, it's like partial emulation, right? The second round of PS3s that could still play PS2 games, partial emulation, which, obviously saves them cost, not putting a bunch of PS2 hardware into the PS3, but then starts to introduce issues here, issues there, on top of the stuff that you already were talking about. Like, this is issues that the launch PS3 had, which aren't issues, just weird little quirks, while literally running PS2 hardware inside of them to play the PS2 games. Once you get partial emulation in the mix, I'm sure it just gets a little bit worse.
Yeah, the compatibility is a lot more spotty. People kind of downplay this, but you can look at lists that are like, it does this, and then it has this issue, and then it has this issue. And that happens for like a lot of popular games, like Jak and Daxter does not want to run on partial emulation. Like, it just doesn't. Granted, there's like Jak and Daxter Collection that can help circumnavigate some of those things. Because you're like, well, if I'm on a PS3, I'll just get the HD collections of some of these, right? But at the end of the day, like, compatibility is like, people estimate from 70 to 80% of the PS2's library will run, which will pretty much always mean that you'll have like a couple games in your library that are not going to run, right? Because if you're like, well, I have 10 PS2 games, on average, 2 or 3 of those are not going to play. Is that really what you want? Not really. One thing I also found out with the partial emulation thing that literally nobody talks about is, remember how I said that the PS2 games were, on the whole, usually just a little bit too skinny? On the partial emulation consoles, they're a little bit too fat. They stretch them too much in the other direction. And so everything's just stretched out just a little bit too much. And it's so infuriating that one goes too far in one direction and the other goes too far in the other direction. Like, the only stuff that I've seen about this online, people are like, yeah, I don't know which one's more correct. Well, the answer is neither. Neither are more correct. Technically, the full backwards compatible one with no emulation is technically a little bit more correct, because that's giving you the square pixels that are coming straight out of the PlayStation 2. It's just not taking into account any form of stretching that your CRT is going to be doing. Whereas the other one just stretches it way too much. It's not a full 16:9 by any means, but it does stretch it too much. But yeah, then the PlayStation 2 compatibility was just completely stripped out of PS3s past a certain point, and then the Slims and Super Slims just don't have that option entirely, which kind of stinks. But 2 things. 1, PS1 games can run on any PlayStation 3. A lot of people will be like, oh, well, it's only the early PS3s that can play PS1 games. Nope. Doesn't matter what PS3 you have, it will be able to play PS1 games. And there's even like a little adapter that you can get that has PS1 or PS2 memory cards that you can plug in your memory card and transfer your save data onto your PlayStation 3. So you can literally take your old saves and continue them on a PlayStation 3 and then send them back to the memory card, which is really neat and really cool. You can't really plug any controllers in, but at the end of the day, like, the PlayStation 3 DualShock / 6-axis is exactly the same, except for you have the stupid triggers that make your finger slip. But other than that, like, everything's exactly the same. So that's not a huge deal either. And most people, I'm sure, would rather take the wireless compatibility over the wired old controllers. Anyway, one additional thing that I can do is play PlayStation 2 classics, which I tried out for the first time, and it uses the exact same method as the partial emulation, backwards compatible PS2s, wherein everything is just a little bit too stretched. So those are the same. Those are exactly the same. How you are going to get PlayStation 2 games, they're going to be displayed very, very similar with those. But yeah, those are same thing. You just have to buy something digitally, and you can't use your original disc. So is that really backwards compatibility? That's entirely up to you.
Yeah. But you ended up getting rid of your fat PS3, right?
Well, yeah, it wasn't working, so I returned it. It wasn't just that, but also, man, these things run hot. They run hot and they run loud, the original fat ones. And from what I've heard, like aside from the laser issues, they're just not that reliable and like to overheat. Like people love talking about how the 360 red rings and overheats. PS3s are better, but they're not that much better. You still have to be worried about the thermals of those things. And they will likely kill themselves with too much use, too much heat. So there's that. So yeah, PlayStation 3s, original fat PlayStation 3s, very cool, but please buy at your own risk, I guess. It's like,
yeah, because they have a lot of problems.
They have a lot of problems. It's something that I wish was a cool, all-inclusive solution, and it kind of is, but it's not a practical all-in-one solution.
And even when we get to the much later revisions of the PS3 and stuff, they can still all just play. You can put your PS1 discs in them, and that will work. So at least you have that going for you, right?
Yep. That is true.
It is always so interesting to me because like so many people online kind of just like venerate the launch PS3. They're like, wow, it's so cool that it can play PS2 and PS1 games. It kind of sucks.
Yeah.
It kind of stinks.
That's the whole point of this podcast, is because we are like, well, we're going to get our hands on these things. We're going to use them. Is this thing as great as people say? Sometimes the answer is just no. But like, I mean, if you all out there have a PlayStation 3 Fats that works and that you like more power to you. We're not saying that's, wow, you should get rid of that thing because it sucks, actually. I just don't think it is as good of a thing for people to invest in and to buy now as a solution is all we're saying.
Yep, definitely. And then I guess moving on a little bit past that, the PS4, moving past the PS3 architecture was so crazy. No way that the PS4 was going to deal with having hardware in there to play PS3 games. So there's no PS4 backwards compatibility to the PS3. And then the PS5, you can play PS4 games. Cool. Thumbs up. Sounds good.
Very
Easy
similar
PC.
architecture between the PS4 and PS5.
Yeah, very similar architecture. You can literally plug in your it's not the same as physical stuff, but basically is these days because physical media doesn't really exist for video game consoles anymore. You can literally I have a big old terabyte hard drive of my PS4 games that just holds all my PS4 games plugged into my PS5. And that's what it wants to see. It wants to see a PS4 hard drive full of PS4 games to just grab off of and run my games. And it's happy to do it. That's kind of what modern backwards compatibility looks like, unfortunately. But we have a whole episode about physical versus digital games that you can go and listen to already.
The upside is that it will oftentimes play better. Like that's kind of a more newer thing. Like we talked a little bit about the Switch and Switch 2, where the Switch 2 will play Switch 1 games better. That's not the case with most backwards compatibility. Like the PlayStation 2 is not going to really run your PS1 games any better. But PS5 will make your PS4 games, like if they had a shaky frame rate before, it'll make it stable. Like whatever its target was, it will hit that just with like the raw horsepower of it all. Because in essence, like these are the PlayStation 5 is just a more powerful PlayStation 4. It has more grunt, it has more horsepower under the hood with very similar architecture. So
yep. And so that's all over the PlayStation, right? It's been very backwards compatibility throughout, very backwards compatible for most of its history. The PS4 to PS3, like PS3 to PS4 jump was a road bump, but like a very understandable one. It would have taken way too much work to get PS3 games playing on the PS4. So, that's understandable. And now we can play the PS4 on the PS5. Cool. And often, like you said, when I was a really early adopter of the PS5, back when they were really hard to find, and there was all those jokes, I think understandably, about how there was basically no PS5 games. Maybe there still aren't that many actual PS5 games. I haven't paid that close attention, but I think I've made the joke on the podcast multiple times, and it was my line then, and it's my line now. I wanted to play my PS4 games without it sounding like there was a jet taking off in my living room. That's the PS4 got long in the tooth, man.
I never owned a PlayStation 4. My PlayStation 5 is my PlayStation 4.
Yep.
It just is. And so that is a cool thing about the PlayStation lineup, is that similar to the Nintendo DS/handheld stuff, is that you can just have a PS5 and a launch PS3. You can play any PlayStation game under the sun, pretty much. Which is very nice and very cool. If you want to be a little bit more practical about it and not worry so much about things overheating, you can bump that number up to 3. Just get a PS2, a PS3, and a PS5. But even so, like being able to remove 2 consoles from the equation and be able to play pretty much everything with very, very minimal issues, I think is really nice to have. And then, yeah, there's the handhelds as well with PlayStation. So the PSP can play PlayStation 1 games because obviously there was no handheld PlayStation before that. But obviously it can't take the physical discs and put them in, so it has to do that through digital downloads. It's kind of emulation. I think it's partial emulation as well. The PSP basically has a souped up PS1 CPU. The PSP uses a R4000. PS1 uses an R3000. And so the R4000 like understands the PS1 instruction set and is like, yeah, sure, I'll execute that. No problem. So the emulation quality is like surprisingly incredible. It's like really good for a dumb handheld from 2005. Like, how is this thing able to play these games from like 5 years ago in some cases? So that's pretty cool. And then obviously there's the PlayStation Vita as well, which can play PlayStation portable games, but again, doesn't have that UMD drive, so you have to get them digital download. So again, is it really backwards compatibility? That is entirely up to you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, probably not. I think it like kind of is, kind of isn't. I don't know. We've already talked about that on this show, though. So I do really like. I think like a bare minimum in my mind is kind of like what like kind of where the Vita. If you have the Vita, you could re-download your digitally purchased PSP games, and play that. That's great. Thumbs up. That counts in my mind. In our modern day and age, that counts. Buying a PS1 game on a PSP, no. Doesn't count. Sorry.
What? You can digitally buy it and you can play it on your PS3 or your PS1. What do you mean? Or
Murph,
you just
talk to me about the Xbox.
No. You just mod your PSP and put whatever games you want on it. There you go.
Good
Problem
point.
solved.
Yeah.
Not a problem.
Well, that is the crazy thing about the Vita a little bit is that I think that like if they had, for whatever reason, if they had thrown a UMD reader onto a Vita, it would have worked just fine. If you have a modded Vita, you can simply instruct the Vita to launch the PSP software and it will do so. It's all in there.
Yep. And it'll do it great. It'll do it fine.
Yeah.
The Vita screen is exactly 2x resolution of a PSP screen.
It launches the PSP OS. It's in the Vita. It's in there. You just never see it unless you work around to getting there.
Yeah, crazy.
Much like the Wii and the Wii U, I would guess, actually. But
yeah, it's just like, actually, I'm going to be a PSP now.
I'm going to be a PSP now, but we're going to skip the whole going to the Wii menu part.
Yeah.
And just launch the game. Yeah. Okay, Murph, I'm serious, though. You're the Xbox guy here. We have one major console manufacturer left here to talk about. I am not all that versed in the Xbox world beyond being a pretty big original Xbox head. You know, never had a 360. I technically have a One. I obviously don't have a Series. Walk me through with what is Xbox's backwards compatibility history and capabilities look like.
You thought the PlayStation backwards compatibility was weird. Xbox might be the one that's weirder.
Yep, sure.
It's better in some ways and worse in other ways. So, Original Xbox obviously doesn't have backwards compatibility with anything. It's the first one. The 360, though. One thing that a lot of people forget about the 360 is that it does have backwards compatibility with original Xbox games. There's many caveats with this. Number one, you need a hard drive. You need an official Microsoft hard drive because the actual emulator that they use in order to emulate these things exists on that hard drive. So if you buy a third-party hard drive, you can't do it. Which is why, for the longest time, I never knew that this existed, is because I bought a 360 for dirt cheap, saw the prices of hard drives, and was like, no thanks, let me go buy a third-party one. So I bought a third-party hard drive instead. But eventually I was like, oh, wait, this is a thing? Maybe I should buy an official one. This was years later when the prices had gone up pretty significantly, and I could just get one on the secondhand market for a lot cheaper. So I did, and I was like, oh, this is kind of neat. So the 360 can play original Xbox games, but it can only play about half of them. And of those half, there are issues because it does use emulation in order to make it work. And the 360 fully emulating a console that is already like a reasonably powerful console from the previous generation. There's 4 years, count them 4 years between the launch of the original Xbox and the release of the 360, which is not a long time for technology. And the 360 just fully emulates these things. It has a full functional original Xbox emulator on board. And so the fact that this works at all, kind of incredible, kind of insane, actually, if you think about it. Because there is zero hardware that is shared. It is completely different architecture. Original Xbox is x86. It's very PC-like, whereas the 360 is PowerPC based. It's a lot more similar to like the GameCube's PowerPC. It's a lot more console. But yeah, it does work, but it doesn't work amazingly. Some things will work better. So like Burnout 3, for example. Burnout 3 is probably my favorite example because it's, you put it in and it plays it. It'll enable the widescreen mode if it has it, which is really nice. And it will give you like a smoother image. It's not going to make anything blurrier. It's going to up-res to 720p. It's going to look nice. And I think it does look nicer on the 360 and plays just as good as it does on the original Xbox. So big thumbs up there. But you start to run into issues the deeper you go into the library. You'll start to get like frame stutters. FMVs will only play at half speed across the board. Like pretty much every FMV that you run into for any original Xbox game is not going to run at full speed. There will be missing effects, things like that. And some like places that have slowdown where there wasn't slowdown before. Maybe some screen tearing, like Simpsons Hit and Run has like weird amounts of screen tearing.
A lot of screen tearing.
The original Xbox has some screen tearing in it too, to be fair, but the 360 adds even more screen tearing to the mix. So I don't recommend the 360 as like a replacement for the original Xbox. It's a good accompaniment. We're like, hey, there are a few games that will play better, and sometimes just playing it with a wireless controller on a 360 is something that you might want. The original Halo games all work, and they work just fine. So you can be like, okay, well, I want to have a 360 as like a Halo LAN box, and you can have that, and you can have that work for like all the Halo games from Halo 1, 2, 3, 4, Reach. I guess obviously nothing past that because, you know, those released for later consoles, but you can do that. So it's, yeah, super iffy. Would not recommend, but it's fun to mess around with for sure. But the Xbox One, this is one where, similar to the 360, the 360 has it fully emulated. And they started by saying like, hey, here's some games that you can play. And then we'll keep adding to the list. We'll keep adding to the list through download patches. And like, all right, now we'll unlock this and this one, and then this game, and then this game. And eventually they ended in 2007 at about half the library. The Xbox One very much did the same thing, but they started like in 2015, I think it was. So it was a couple of years into the Xbox One's life cycle. They're like, hey, we're going to start a 360 backwards compatibility program, also using emulation. And this is where the emulation is really good. It's like weirdly good. Not even in like a 360 where you're like, wow, the fact that they were able to do this at all is incredible. The Xbox One emulation of 360 games usually will provide a better experience than playing something on a 360.
Which is kind of crazy.
But again,
it makes sense, but it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, the Xbox One goes back to x86 based architecture, and it is very different from the 360. So it is, again, all emulation, but it will usually like stabilize frame rate. So this is kind of like the beginning, I would say, of more modern backwards compatibility, where the emulation is quite good. It'll often yield performance benefits, and sometimes they might even go above and beyond. Like starting with the Xbox One X, they started giving out these patches of like, oh, well, here's like a 4K patch for the 360. Like, we will give you additional benefits past, just make sure that the code runs at all on the Xbox One. We'll give you additional benefits. And then even going deeper into the Xbox Series stuff, like, yes, they can play all Xbox One games, but they would continue the Xbox 360 compatibility and are like, okay, well, here's a 60 FPS performance bump up from a 30 FPS performance. Like, we will give you very obvious performance bumps in order to make like a really good 360 gaming experience that is usually, in my opinion, the best way to experience these games. At the very least, the best way to experience these games on console. And so, yeah, that's why I really like the Xbox backwards compatibility. Again, it does not cover everything. It covers, I want to say, about half of the 360, give or take. It hits a lot of the good ones, but there are just some things that you're like, oh, I want to play this, but too bad, tough. So it's hard to say, yes, I want to play a bunch of 360 games and still not have a 360 hooked up, because there are just some games that you're going to miss, which does suck. And they ended the 360 backwards compatibility program. They're like, we're not adding any more to this. One additional benefit of this is that there's actually some original Xbox games that you can play too. Not nearly as many.
I was going to say, I know I've like tried to mess around with that specifically a little bit, and it is really hit or miss, but it is there.
Yeah, it is there. Some of them are really good, like Panzer Dragoon Orta. Upres is real nice, real smooth. So you can get some very, very good performance. You can get some good results out of these. But yeah, there's just not that many. And it's not a great way to be like, yeah, I suppose I'll do this instead of having the original Xbox. It's a good companion piece. So that's kind of the downside of this whole Xbox plan, is that it's very hard to take a piece and remove it. Like, you kind of still need to have an original Xbox, a 360, an Xbox Series. You don't need that Xbox One, because the Series like kind of just replaces it and plays all your Xbox One games just fine. But of those other ones, like, you just still need to have those hooked up, because you will run into compatibility issues here or there, or something that doesn't run, yada yada. So, but when it runs, when you find something that is a benefit and an improvement, it will be a tangible improvement, which you can't say for all backwards compatibility.
Yep. It makes it tough.
That is for sure. But like, it's really nice, especially because like PS3 and 360 games, not known for their great frame rates. So if you want to play a game from this era, taking one of these 360 games and playing it on an Xbox One or Series is probably a really, really good option.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really good option, and it's a lot of fun, and you can just do it. And it works. Hopefully,
yeah. You just try it. You'll always have to download a patch.
Yes.
Every single time you stick a disc in. But that is a nice thing. Like, you stick a disc in, you can even buy these titles digitally if you want. You can do either or, which I really like. Because some are just like, well, it's only if you have the disc. Oh, it's only if you digitally download it. These are, you can do both.
Yeah, makes it a little better, makes it a little nicer.
Yeah,
it just works out just fine. And that's every single thing about backwards compatibility on the Xbox, which I have nothing to say about, because I have literally no experience except for randomly trying to fit some different Xbox games I happen to have around into my Xbox One, which I no longer even have hooked up anymore.
Ooh.
And I guess that's everything we have to say about backwards compatibility in general. So it's time for us to move on to our one recurring segment of the show, which is our recent pickups. I have nothing. Murph, I know you have something. What do we got?
So I have been getting into Persona 3 Portable on the PSP, and I'm like, hey, this is actually really fun. But I know that there's a bunch of different versions of Persona 3. I know there's Reload, there's the original, there's FES, and Portable, obviously, and they all have like different pros and cons from what I understand. So I'm just jamming through Portable just because I think it's fun. It's a good time. I really like the point and click aspect of things. It is really fast and really snappy, which I love. But yeah, there is something to be said for having like an actual world to walk around in. And I was like, oh, well, what does that even look like? So I picked up Persona 3 FES just because it was cheap enough. And I was like, well, I want to try it out and see what it is. And it's neat. Portable does cut out more stuff than I thought. Like the FMVs are like completely scaled down. They're mostly pictures, which kind of sucks because the anime cutscenes are really neat and really cool. You also lose some personality of like the character models like walking around.
Sure.
You miss like where they are in the space, who's there in the scene until they talk. So it is just very interesting to see the differences of. I'm not going to play FES right now, but if I ever play Persona 3 again, FES or Reload would probably be another option. And then also with that, I ended up buying Persona 4 because I was like, okay, well, this is a cool series.
No, he's all the way in now.
I'm all the way in. Might as well have that as well. Just get it in a cool, neat little bundle. Persona 3, Persona 4. But yeah, I'll
Nice.
play Persona 4 eventually. Probably not anytime soon, especially since Persona is just kind of a huge time commitment.
Yes, it is. It is a massive time commitment.
Yeah, so I'm not going to jump into 80 to 100 hour game straight into another 80 to 100 hour game. I'm just not going to do it.
That's part of the problem that I've run into. I love those games so much, and I've played I've almost completed 4. I have completed 5. I've played 5 twice. I've played their newest title with the medieval RPG-ish fantasy one, which was a lot of fun. But I would love to go back to play more of these Persona games, man. But man, 70, 80, 90, 100 hours. If you're being real careful, easily can stretch above 100, depending on how different aspects of the game go for you, how completionist you're being, all that kind of stuff, how quickly you're reading text. Your reading speed can really change the playtime of these games.
That's one of the reasons why I like Portable, is because it is just to the point very much. In the overworld, obviously combat is combat and the story beats are pretty similar, but when you're actually quote unquote wandering around in the overworld, it's very quick to get around, and so that cuts out a lot of the downtime, which I like.
Yep, that's sounds like a good time, and realistically, I think that would be the best way for me to engage with it as well. We've talked about it before. We've talked about you playing Persona 3 Portable on the show before, and I think realistically, if I am ever going to finish Persona 3, it will probably have to be P3P, just because it probably cuts out about 15, maybe 10 hours of wandering around or whatever you just don't do, which may be an enjoyable aspect of the game, get you a little more into it, but nah, I don't need it.
That's totally fair.
Well, Murph, I think that's all we have for this one. So I will wish you happy gaming on Persona 3 and 4.
Thanks. Thank you all for listening / watching. Have yourselves a great rest of the day, and happy gaming.
Bye-bye.